From the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored, this is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
Slavery existed. Slavery is a barbaric practice. It's a stain on the founding. It's kind of the central stain. You know, on the one hand, they didn't get rid of slavery in 1776. But what's amazing is that a bunch of people, many of whom owned slaves, declared that all men are created equal. That is, they put the principle down in the Declaration of Independence, and then American history is a playing out of those principles.
This is your host, Scot Bertram, and that's Dr. Matthew Spalding, Vice President of Washington Operations and Dean of the Van Andel Graduate School of Government at Hillsdale in D.C. We talk in depth with Dr. Spalding today about what citizens should learn about America and civics education across the country. Dr. Spalding, thanks so much for joining us.
Good to be with you, Scott.
Talking today about a piece you wrote in the Washington Examiner, what should citizens learn about America and civics education in general? Why is civics education important?
Well, that's actually a great way to start the conversation, and the title of the piece kind of actually alludes to the problem itself, which is the question here is there a certain type of education that is above and beyond, say, technical education or history simply or literature, but a certain type of education that is appropriate for citizens? Traditionally, we have referred to this as civic education. There's a type of education that a citizen, especially in a free country, in an American country in particular, the American constitutional republic, citizens ought to know certain things about their country, about how it works, about the rule of law, the Constitution, rights, human equality. And that's crucial for being a good citizen, in a republic. And a component of that is that you need to know how the history of the American regime began and played those principles out and what their status is today. So there's actually a much broader question here in terms of why is this type of education important, say, in the United States, a free republic in which we self-govern, as opposed, say, a monarchy in the past, or a closed society, or in China. Right here, it's actually important for self-governing citizens to be educated about the source of their rights and ability to govern themselves under the rule of law. That's actually a component of citizenship, which has to be taught in the context of education in order to continue that understanding of citizenship.
So how would you describe the overall state of civics education in our country today, and why are we kind of having this ongoing debate over the topic? Well,
that's, so it partially goes back to the very definition I've given, which is there actually is great disagreement about that. So civics education today is in bad shape. Polling suggests this, both in terms of knowledge of history, but also knowledge of the workings of the American political process, if you will. And that's been getting worse over time. And I can come back to kind of a couple of phases about why it's been getting worse. But the general thing to understand is that there are large segments of especially the American Academy, when these ideas come out of the universities and are kind of bleeding into debates about education. But this kind of idea of education coming from the academy into, shall we call it, the education bureaucracy that really dominates education, especially the K-12 level. Mm-hmm. There's a sense that we ought not to teach civic education as a knowledge, as an amount of as something where you're transferring information into the minds of these students, because that's biased. But it's also grounded in the various historical problems, the existence of slavery being one of the most prominent. But also, we should do other things with them. So, for instance, the two things I think have especially fed the decline of civic education. One is in previous decades, in the kind of the later 20th century, which was a tendency to look at civics And we don't want to look at civics as knowledge, that is, you should know about American history or how government works or sources of your rights, but as an activity.
Mm-hmm.
So there's something called, for instance, action civics,
Yes.
which is very dominant in many schools today, which is we don't actually teach you knowledge as much as we teach you to go out and get involved. Well, that's not an unimportant thing, but it's actually not an educational activity for a school. It actually teaches students to, we're encouraging them to get involved in local campaigns and can become very much an activism. So that's one problem I think that has really hurt civic education. The other thing more recently, which we all see around us, is the rise of alternatives, which is really based on a criticism of American history, which you see in diversity, equity, and inclusion, critical race theory, which is this kind of backwards looking at history. Well, slavery was really bad. It's barbaric, which I agree with. But you look backwards in history, and any evidence of that in existence means that those institutions and that history is itself racist, and therefore shouldn't be taught at all. Indeed, you should teach an alternative history, which is that the founding was racist. And so that's a much more ideological attack on the concept of civic education, in many ways intended to replace it with something else, and that's the debate many local school districts are now actively involved in.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Matthew Spalding with us, Vice President of Washington Operations and Dean of the Van Andel Graduate School of Government at Hillsdale in D.C. Hillsdale has entered the conversation, continued the conversation with something called the 1776 curriculum. We've discussed it on the show previously, and part of your essay at the Examiner responds to some of the attacks on the curriculum. Some say it whitewashes or rewrites or omits parts of history. What do critics get wrong about 1776 and what Hillsdale does?
Well, I mean, part of it goes back to this conversation we just had, which is there's this debate over civics itself. And what is really an issue here is Hillsdale's 1776 curriculum is actually itself not at all radical. It's not at all controversial. It's actually what a good civics education ought to be.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that the civics debate, and especially the American educational debate, driven by a lot of the kind of the education bureaucrats in the academy, meaning the academia, has moved away from that, and so as a result, they're highly critical of a more traditional approach. But it's kind of apparent in my references before, which is that civics education should be based on giving knowledge, about teaching knowledge, about teaching chronology and actual history and events, especially looking back to core documents and core significant individuals. It should be historically based, especially. It shouldn't be based on a current ideological debate and then looking backwards to basically teach people about the current ideological debate. That's the huge divide here. And so the current critics are largely wanting to talk about current political ideological issues.
Mm-hmm.
And so anything that goes back and actually tries to teach history, they are critical of because they think it should be taught ideologically. And that really is the nub of the problem.
How should one balance promoting reverence for our founding fathers, in some ways astonishment at what was accomplished, while also acknowledging our shortcomings throughout history?
So this gets back to the real deep underlying problem of this more ideological approach, which is increasingly dominant in the teaching profession.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, if you look back and teach ideologically, first of all, that's bad history. It's backwards history. You're teaching history backwards. But more importantly, you have ideology puts blinders on you, so you can't actually see the history itself. Which is, you also can't see the good of the history. The best way to teach history is to teach it warts and all, as we like to say, to teach it and not ignoring the past, but to teach it honestly. So if you look at the American founding, for instance, which is the centerpiece of American civic education, slavery existed. Slavery is a barbaric practice. It's a stain on the founding. It's kind of the central stain. But what's amazing is that, on the one hand, they didn't get rid of slavery in 1776. But what's amazing is that a bunch of people, many of whom owned slaves, declared that all men are created equal. That is, they put the principle down in the Declaration of Independence, and then American history is a playing out of those principles. As history actually occurs, it's individuals trying as best they can, sometimes failing, sometimes accomplishing great movements forward, living up to those principles. And that's how you teach history in a way that tells the real story based on the actual facts, the good, the bad, and the ugly. But it also allows you to realize that in doing so, they accomplished these great and amazing things in Western civilization that really is a culmination of long histories well before America, that it led to the fact that you could establish a nation that begins with a principle that ultimately leads to the abolition of slavery. And that history is actually quite monumental, because at the same time, they're also building a very successful nation, this great economy, this widespread constitutional liberty, which allows for flourishing of self-government, religious freedom, people escaping from Europe. All those elements are tied in here together. And the problem with ideologies, when you look back with these blinders, you really miss all of that history, because all you're teaching is one ideological thing that you want to use basically throughout the baby with the bathwater.
When you talk about the ideological lens or the perspectives that begin to enter into civics education, if we go back, we look at primary documents. Is that a way to counteract or sort of get away from the ideological perspectives?
That's the primary way to do so. But the general concept here is, if you're teaching history, you're teaching the founding, let's say, or George Washington, you're teaching Abraham Lincoln or Frederick Douglass, you're teaching about events. Well, those events are done by individuals. And the obligation, your first obligation as a historian, is to come to understand it as they understood it. Right? I mean, they didn't have the knowledge we have today. They didn't have. They don't know what happens next. They don't know what's going to happen. They're doing the best they can. They're flawed individuals. They're imperfect, but they're also intelligent, rational, capable of thinking things through. So, how do you do that? Well, you try to kind of get into their minds to the extent you can as a historian, and a primary way to do it is to actually look at actual things they wrote, primary documents. That's why you emphasize that, because they wrote them at the time, and that tells you a lot. So a good history will be dominated by original documents, the key figures that had a lot to say and did a lot of the key things and were involved in the events at the time. And it will maximize that, and it will minimize, if not completely get rid of, current thinkers looking back and postulating what may or may not have been the case, or worse, looking back through their ideological blinders and reinterpreting a narrative to lead to their ideological outcome, which is what you really see today when you think about the great distinctions between, say, a traditional curriculum like Hillsdale's and something like the 1619 Project, which really seeks to reinterpret American history, oftentimes getting many of the facts wrong, but it's not about the facts from their point of view, it's about the narrative. And the narrative is that America is a racist country inherently, and thus it needs to go in a different direction currently ideologically. It's not about history at all. It's about politics in a very current sense. So I don't actually even consider that to be civics history at all.
What kind of a student should a proper civics education attempt to form, and what virtues should it attempt to cultivate in them?
No, that's another very great question. I think the one way to answer is, first of all, talk about what it's not intended to create. A good civic education, meaning, and here I mean a good civic education in the context of America, should seek to create a good citizen, and a good citizen is liberal, to which I don't mean conservative versus liberal or left versus right. I mean in the sense that they're liberal as in liberal education. They're liberally minded. They understand what are the core principles here: human equality, consent, equal rights, liberty, self-government, rule of law, constitutionalism. It doesn't mean they all agree on every particular. It doesn't mean they're of one political party or another. It doesn't mean they're of a particular religion or any of these things. But the reason you have civic education in the first place, its justification, is to form a citizen who will be able to self-govern, participate in the governing process, respect the rights of their fellow citizens, and actually defend those rights when they come under threat. Because that is the one thing that we need to agree on, despite our differences on policies and politics and left and right. The only way this will work is if we agree on a certain underlying framework, which is what's the process by which we do disagree. Well, that requires what? The rule of law and the Constitution. It requires that we all participate and consent to how we're governed. And that, in turn, requires that we all understand we are equal before the eyes of the law. We have equal liberty. We have equal rights. No one matters more than anybody else. So it does form a certain type of person, and it does form a certain type of character. You respect the law. It moderates your passions in a way. It encourages your deliberation as opposed to your immediate reactions. But it's not intended to give immediate political opinions. Although, unfortunately, because of the debate we find ourselves in over civic education more broadly, right, that general thing I've just described, which is not left, right, or center, it's just a general concept of citizenship, that itself is oftentimes criticized, which is deeply unfortunate, especially when you think about the kind of the future of how we continue to self-govern ourselves.
Dr. Matthew Spalding with us. A final question. Is it important or should it be a goal of a proper civics education and what citizens should learn about America to leave that education with a positive vision or a positive view of America?
Absolutely, but let's parse for just a moment what exactly that means. I mean, when the critic says it, it means that we're trying to brainwash our children and our citizens to believe that America never made a mistake and it's perfect in every way, and it's all its leaders are kind of demigods. Well, okay, there's a limit to how far that goes, but there is kind of a sense of a kind of informed, intelligent patriotism. That is the objective here, and so what you want to do is you want to teach students to, especially as they grow up, from small children to high schoolers, and as they're maturing, right? You're teaching them that yes, history is imperfect. The vessels of history, these individuals are themselves perfect. They often make mistakes, which is the human condition, and yet here's what they've accomplished. And I think laid out that way and looked at that way, one can see that as with other people around us today, right, there are flaws and imperfections and mistakes, but yet the larger accomplishment is of great magnitude, especially when you think about it compared to the rest of the world and all of previous history. And the answer is yes. I mean, patriotism, which is love of country, doesn't mean that there are a lot of things you love.
Right.
I can think of family members, right? They're greatly imperfect.
Yes.
But you still love them. And so there is definitely a sense of that, and that is an objective of this type of education. But it doesn't mean blind love. It means informed and thoughtful love that sees things with clear eyes, but can see the flaws, can also see the good. And so that is at the heart of a good civic education.
You can read Dr. Spalding's essay at the Washington Examiner, WashingtonExaminer.com. It is What Should Citizens Learn About America? Dr. Matthew Spalding is Vice President of Washington Operations and Dean of the Van Andel Graduate School of Government at Hillsdale in D.C. Dr. Spalding, thanks for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thanks, Scott.
Up next, Tim Carney from the Washington Examiner. We'll talk with him about babies and whether Americans should be having more. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Hello, this is Kyle Mernon, Director of Online Learning here at Hillsdale College, and I'm excited to announce that we've brought Hillsdale's popular free online courses to the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. And our next course is The Real American Founding, which is taught by Hillsdale professors David Azrad and Thomas West. After completing this course, you'll understand the political theory of the American founding, and you'll see how and why we've departed so far from the American founding today. This Hillsdale College online course podcast is hosted by me and my colleague Juan Davalos, and it looks to expand Hillsdale's mission to provide all who wish to learn the education necessary to preserve the civil and religious liberties of America, and we want you to be a part of it at podcast.hillsdale.edu. Subscribe now to the Hillsdale College Online Courses podcast to hear new episodes every week with additional commentary and insights from our team. Go to podcast.hillsdale.edu to learn more. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu. Thanks for listening.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to check out the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. You can find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu. We're joined by Tim Carney. He is columnist at the Washington Examiner, also a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, AEI.org. You can find him on X, formerly Twitter, at TP Carney. Tim, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I want to talk to you today about babies.
Yes.
You know a little about that. How many do you have?
We have 6 kids.
6.
The oldest of whom is currently visiting Hillsdale. So, yes.
And with 6 children, you'd fit right in the Hillsdale community. There's no doubt about that. But birth rates, you've written a couple of times in the past and actually are working on a book right now that will be out in early mid-2024 about this topic, the crisis of collapsing birth rates in the U.S. Why should we treat it as a topic that deserves that word, crisis?
For a couple of reasons. One is while we are now having 1.6, 1.7 babies per woman, the average American in the recent poll said that 2.7 was the ideal family. So we're falling a whole baby short of what our ideal is. And I don't think everybody needs to get their ideal, right? Like my ideal house would have a wraparound porch, but family is something that really matters. And so if we're all falling this far short in what our ideal is, that tells us something is wrong. But then having low and falling birth rates really poses economic and sociological problems. It's bad for the economy. It's bad for culture.
What are those consequences? Culture, economy, what are we losing by not reaching our target birth rate?
Yes. So 2.1 is a replacement rate. A lot of people know that. So 1.6, eventually the population starts shrinking. But before that, right now we already have fewer children in America than we did 10 years ago. The baby bust started in 2008, and so the 2010s was a decade of millennials not pulling their weight. And so there are actually a few fewer children in America today than there were 10 years ago. What does that mean? That means that the potential workforce in a few years will start shrinking. So that is the number of people between the ages of 18 and 65 will start going down in the next couple of years and go down for the foreseeable future. So it's easy to think of Social Security not being able to pay its bills because you have fewer workers and more retirees. But that's only just, I think that's like an image of what's really happening. There will be retired people who need to buy stuff at a record high level, and there will be fewer workers providing those services or making those goods or delivering them than there were earlier. So as we have an increasing number of retirees and a decreasing number of workers, guess what? Have you liked the inflation and the supply chain disruption of the last few years? That's going to become a lot more acute when the baby bust hits a working age.
The ideal family size question, when people are asked, you say the answer ends up being 2.7. We're nowhere near that. And in fact, if you look the opposite, meaning who says 0, who says 1 is ideal, essentially nobody.
Almost nobody.
9% total.
Every one of those people is a columnist for the Washington Post, right? You read these all the time. And so now Gen Z, I think if you asked high school seniors and college kids, they're much more likely to say that they don't think they ever want to have kids. Millennials, the story of millennials, though, is that they wanted to get married later, start having kids later, but still have 2.7. And a lot of them are finding that that's just not in the cards. But the story of Gen Z might be a darker one. It could be that number that says 0 or 1 will grow. And I think that is a result of the baby bust. So you guys know the word Malthusian. Thomas Malthus was an economist who argued that birth rates were like prices. As they fell, people got richer. And then when people were richer, they were able to have more kids, but that made them poor, that they were self-correcting, right? Now, the study I've done has shown that in the modern world, when birth rates fall below 2.1, they basically just keep going down. It's self-reinforcing.
So why aren't we reaching what people say is the ideal family size? You've written a few things about this. I wanted to ask about, if a culture is anti-baby, people won't have babies. And inside that, this idea of civilizational sadness, and it's different perhaps on where you look. Overseas, overwork, but here in the U.S. there is this strange climate fear that overtakes people and makes them afraid to bring new people into the world. How much does that, literally affect the way people see their children?
It's certainly the top reason given by young people who say they may not have children. Like, I don't know, but I might not. The top reason they give is worry about the climate. Now, I don't like to sort of psychoanalyze everybody, but Ezra Klein made a good point that there will be no climate disaster in the United States. And Ezra Klein is a big believer that climate change is real and it's happening, but rich countries can adapt. So the fact that our young people say there's going to be a climate disaster, he says that's really a cover story for guilt, that white rich people have destroyed the planet. I think that's true, but I think that guilt isn't just about climate. I think it's about a real belief that we're not good, that we're destroying the environment through pollution, through litter. That people always bring up litter when they say why they don't want to have kids. It's very interesting. That we're vectors for disease, that we're all irreparably racist, a lack of belief in basic human goodness. Why would you want to make more humans if you think humans are bad? I think that the climate is a cover story for guilt, and the guilt is rooted in a misanthropy and a false anthropology.
Talking with Tim Carney here about the crisis of collapsing birth rates. You have written that a culture, or our culture now, supports raising children less than it used to. In what ways do we see that? No,
and that's why I call the book Family Unfriendly, is that a culture needs to support kids. A wise woman put it well. It takes a village to raise a child. And it's hard to, sometimes you don't even realize how family unfriendly we are until you go to a place that's super family friendly. I mean, Hillsdale is a family friendly place. The professors here think it's normal to have 4 kids. And
actually, they think 4 is too few.
To have 4 kids within the first 6 years. Or Mormon, Utah, some of the book and the articles I've written are out of places like that, or BYU, Idaho. And I went to Israel, which is very family friendly, very supportive of people having kids. One guy put it this way. He said, the bus drivers there have a real affection for little kids because a 6-year-old will ride the bus. Now, even the most, urbane 6-year-old is going to need some help, and the bus drivers will stop and, park the bus and help the kid in and give him a seat. And so when you see a real family-friendly culture, or if you live in a family-friendly subculture, you see how the attitude in America is kind of that, well, having a kid is like a consumption choice. Have as many as you want, but don't bug us with it. And so we don't have public spaces that are built to be friendly. A lot of places, kids can't walk anymore. You and I, we used to probably ride our bikes and run all over the town, and suburbs are built less bikeable and less kid walkable than they used to. There's all sorts of ways in which we did think that some people are parents and that's their own problem, rather than deliberately building a community to say, getting married and having kids is what you do when you're an adult. Not everybody, but it's a natural thing.
What about the, I'll call it family disbursement that has been happening over the past 20, 30 years? When I grew up in the Chicago area, my immediate relatives, all of them, both sides of the family, were within a 20-mile radius. And the next generation, well, there's some in Texas and some in Colorado and some in Michigan and some still in Illinois. The lack of that family structure to help support and raise children around you.
One of the best predictors of a woman having a second or third child is how close she lives to her own mother. And again, another place where Israel excels. But that's again, to go back to sort of the columnists at the Washington Post, they think that moving away from mom and dad is the precondition of success in life. It's this independence, this autonomy. which doesn't lend itself well to marriage and parenting. There's one columnist who I cite in the book who talks about how when she was leaving to go on maternity leave, she said, the reason I waited this long is because there's no codified support of parents and children in America. And then 9 months later, she writes a column about how she's been forced to mooch childcare from her mother-in-law. That is, her baby's grandma gets to hang out with her, right. But if it's not the state and it's not the market, they don't see it. So it's this total blindness towards culture and the middle institutions that makes so much of our media class think that the government has to step in, because they reject the fact that community and extended family can play their natural role as the village that can help you raise a child.
What about policies that might encourage more births? He's written about South Korea, where they've spent more than $200 billion over the course of a decade to attempt to boost birth rates. Has that been at all successful?
Not in Korea. Japan has had some mild success, going from the worst in the world to about 1. Hungary has had some mild success, and France has had some mild success. And so what we find is, if you give tons of money, no strings attached, to parents, you can slightly push up the birth rate. And I'll say subsidizing daycare does absolutely nothing. You have to just give it to the parents as a check when they have the baby, and every year a massive child tax credit or child allowance. And it's a significant portion of the economy in France is subsidizing these things. And it pushes them up. The non-immigrant birth rate in France is 1.8, which is high. In the rest of Europe, it's 1.5. So the difference, France's extra spending gets them a third of a baby. So it's not tenable to do it. I support a slightly larger child tax credit. I think on the local level, again, sidewalks, bike lanes. Maybe I sound like a liberal talking about bike lanes, but your kids, you should be able to ignore your kids more when they're 10, 11, 12, 13. And the shape of your community really has something to do with that. Our tax credits that are currently for daycare should just get folded into a slightly bigger tax credit for parents. There's all sorts of subsidies and taxes that make buying a house really expensive. And they say, oh, well, you make it up on the end when you sell it. Well, barriers to entry for family formation are definitely family unfriendly.
Talking with Tim Carney about the crisis of collapsing birth rates. On the community culture perspective, in your last book, you talked about these little platoons that people find in their communities to help. Is there a reason that, I don't know if there are hard numbers, it seems to me that many of those community organizations are dying out, that there is not that participation in those organizations that can help parents and can help kids have stuff to do or have a community to live in? Is there a reason why that you point to that why those things are collapsing? Well,
yeah, in Alienated America, my last book, I basically looked at the updated research from Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone in 2000, where he showed, people go to church less, they volunteer less. When they bowl, they're less likely to be in a bowling league, right? And so that has continued apace from 2000 up to 2019, and then the COVID sort of unfortunately supercharged our disconnection. I think there's all sorts of reasons. I guess the easiest one to point to is that for the middle class and the working class throughout American history, church has been the fundamental institution of civil society. And even our religious, white evangelicals are less likely to go to church now than white evangelicals were 10 years ago. So the unchurching of America means so many people are losing their primary institution of civil society. And again, that's self-reinforcing. We begin to think that only the market or the government can provide our goods, and we just forget that there's something else in the middle.
Tim Carney, columnist with the Washington Examiner, also a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. You can find him on Twitter or X at TP Carney, and look for the book in 2024. The name of it is?
Family Unfriendly.
Family Unfriendly, as we talk about the crisis of the collapsing birth rate. Tim, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thank you.
Up next, we talk with Dr. D.G. Hart from Hillsdale College as we start a brief series on American writer H.L. Mencken. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Whether you've just started teaching or spent decades in the classroom, you know there's always more to learn. But where do you start? Well, here at Hillsdale College, we have the answer for you. Tried and true. a primer on sound pedagogy by Hillsdale College professor Daniel Copeland. In this little book, you'll read lessons from more than 25 years of Dr. Copeland's classroom experience. It's all distilled into 14 easy-to-read chapters on lesson planning, assignments, and classroom management, and it will help you improve your skills and inspire you as a teacher, one of our most important professions. Whether you've been in front of the classroom for years or this is your first year, when you read Tried and True, you'll find something to help you keep improving every single day. You don't need to go at it alone. Let Dr. Copeland's real-world experience encourage you and inspire you. You can get your copy today at hillsdale.edu/true. That's hillsdale.edu/TRUE. Thanks for listening.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. You can follow us on X, formerly Twitter, for show and guest information. We're at Hillsdale Radio. We're joined now by D.G. Hart. He is Associate Professor of History here at Hillsdale College. Dr. Hart, thanks for joining us.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me as well.
Starting a series with you on H.L. Mencken. You've written a book, Damning Words, The Life and Religious Times of H.L. Mencken, and generally are the Mencken person here on campus, so the right person to talk to. In this first conversation, we'll introduce Mencken a bit, and then I want to talk about his ideas and thoughts on professionalism and journalism. Right? So first, tell us a little bit of background on Mencken. Who was he? Why is he worth remembering and talking about today?
Mencken lived from 1880 to 1956, and he grew up relatively well off. His father was a cigar maker in Baltimore. He had great attachment to Baltimore, which may come up in our conversations. And his father, he only had a high school education. His father wanted him to inherit the business. Mencken wanted to be a journalist. His father forced him to take over the business when he graduated high school. And then all of a sudden his father dies. And Mencken is delighted and yet really grieved that he, both those emotions are mixed up in that event. So then he always wanted to be a reporter, starts to work for one of the local newspapers in Baltimore, and he loved it. He talks about in some of his later writing about journalism, that was the best 3 or 4 years of his life, just being on the streets of Baltimore. He was covering everything. Kiwanis meetings, church meetings, murders, or the police beat, etc. But he was a really active, ambitious guy. And he was writing on the side, and he wrote books on the side. He wrote literary criticism on the side. By the 1910s, he takes over editing a magazine called The Smart Set, which was partly literary criticism and I think fiction that he didn't approve of necessarily. And then at the same time, he's still working for the Sun papers in Baltimore, and he has a column that everyone begins to read very actively. This is before syndication, but some, I guess, papers are picking it up. And then he vaults into editing another magazine. He starts a magazine called The American Mercury, which he edits between 1923 and 1933. And in that venue, he was responsible for bringing a lot of authors that are sort of part of the canon, either into life or publishing people like Fitzgerald and others. And he was this really odd figure of being a journalist and being a literary critic. And he kind of has elements that he might be like Ben Shapiro or something. And I talk to students about this, but I can't figure out who would be that Ben Shapiro type figure who would also do literary criticism. Mm-hmm. And then he goes into decline in popularity. He was very popular in the 20s. During the New Deal, he was very critical of the New Deal, and he lost some of his following. But he has a resurgence later in life, late 1930s, early 1940s. He starts to write articles for the New Yorker about his life growing up in Baltimore, which leads to his trilogy of memoirs. First, Happy Days. Second, Newspaper Days. Third, Heathen Days, where he kind of documents his life or talks about different parts of his life. And then he has a major stroke at 1948, which is one of the most tragic parts of his life. He cannot read or write. He can do everything else. He has full functioning limbs and everything else, and he can speak, but he just can't read or write. And so he spends the last 8 years of his life in that state. He was married briefly for 5 years in the 1930s, otherwise lived at home with his mother, who died around 1926, or with his brother. They inherited the family home.
Let's talk a little about his work in journalism with The Sun and elsewhere. What did he bring to the table that was different or unique? Why did he become so popular in the 20s?
He was a force and a promoter, in a way, of himself. I guess one way to explain it, too, is that he became involved, and this is true in the 20s, but even before this. Theodore Dreiser was a novelist with whom he had a love-hate relationship, and they both more or less depended on each other. Mencken was a champion of Dreiser, but that was in some ways for Mencken to promote himself, and Dreiser needed somebody to promote him, so he liked it, even though they had a falling out. And there were obscenity laws that kept Dreiser's books out of print for a time. And Mencken was a big champion of free speech and making sure that defending Dreiser in various ways. And I think notoriety that came to Mencken with that episode, for instance, was one reason why he was, but he was also writing in the 19-teens about American culture and American politics in ways that were unusual, at least, and very provocative. And he could say it very well. He was a great writer. He tried his hand at prose and poetry. I mean, fiction and poetry, and it didn't work, but he had his own style, which I think has literary aspects to it. So all those things kind of combined, being an editor, being a defender of someone like that, he began to get attention in the press. He was already in the press, but I think he was fairly restrained about writing about himself. So, but there are stories in the 1920s when the American Mercury starts, that every college student in America wanted to be seen holding a copy of the American Mercury. It was this bright green cover. Even Perry Miller, who was a famous historian of Puritanism at Harvard, confessed to being that way when he was a student. So partly through controversy, partly through press coverage of the events in which he was involved, he becomes that figure, but he also becomes a gatekeeper. And so people want to work with him in various ways. And so that also adds to the lure.
In 1924, he wrote a kind of reflection on the changing atmosphere of his line of work in journalism and the increasing, as he put it, professionalism of journalism. What did he mean by that phrase, and what did he think about that?
He didn't think it was good. What he meant by it was, and this may be his own, although I don't think he really resented not having gone to college. I think he was kind of proud of that, actually. But he did notice that more and more journalists were going to college, and this was becoming a profession for them. When he started, you had a bunch of probably hacks, he would call them. Some guys were dipsomaniacs. Some guys needed to have all of their copy rewritten. But you just had this swarm of reporters out on the streets covering different things, and they weren't necessarily trying to make a name for themselves. They didn't necessarily have an ideological perspective. And newspapers then were, it seems to me, also much more, I mean, they were a business, they're always a business, but the way that they made their money then was advertising, and it was local advertising, it wasn't national advertising. So these were institutions, papers, publications that were bound up with the city. And so you had people, who were products of the city, who kind of liked the city. Maybe they knew its faults. They could write about it in that way. But they're very local institutions. And I think he also saw that with the college and professional classes coming in, they weren't as local. They might be moving from somewhere else, so they didn't understand the city as well. But then they were also people had to pay a mortgage. They had families. They had kids. And so they were not... They were dependent on a salary, and they were unwilling, I think, to take risks in what they were covering, what they were writing, standing up to editors. So I think he thinks journalism may have become better in some respects, but it also lost some of what had made it at least really arresting by covering a lot of weird stuff in cities.
I wanted to ask about this, and I don't know of a better place to do so in our conversations. About Mencken's love for and relationship with the city of Baltimore and his journalism, his coverage of what was happening in the city. How would you describe the way that Mencken and Baltimore, the entity, interacted with each other?
That is a really fascinating question, at least to me, because I'm thinking now about Mencken's declining lure in a city that's overwhelmingly black, and he has a reputation of having been a racist, which, you depending on your definitions and what pieces of writing you look to. And so I worry about Mencken's future in the city, but I do think there was a period between the 1920, say, and even 1980, which would have been the 100th anniversary of his birth, when the city and Mencken and his reputation were bound up together. But and it's fitting in many respects because Mencken really did love the city. I'm teaching a course this semester on Mencken, and the collection of writings I'm using doesn't include this particular essay called On Living in Baltimore. But he has many great things to say about the city, but he says he loves to work in New York and make money there, but come back to Baltimore and spend it there. He describes the charms of the city, though, as not the greatest city in the world, but just kind of a modest but very pleasant place to live and work. And he certainly knows all about problems in the city, whether it be politics or various kinds of people living there that he doesn't like. So he's not celebrating this. He rarely celebrated anything. But it's Baltimore and the wider Maryland area are just in his bones. He just knew it. And it was who he was. He writes, the stuff he writes about food is great. And he talks about the Chesapeake Bay is a protein factory. And he has another essay, I think maybe the same one, talking about how to grill soft-shell crabs, but wrap them in bacon. And it's a wonderful description of this. You eventually put it on a roll and eat it that way. So very appreciative of Baltimore, and it's what put Mencken on the map, having worked there. In a way, what part of what put him on the map, too, to go back to the other question, I forgot to mention this, about journalism and his rise. 1904, there was a big fire in the city that he wound up being the managing editor of the paper during that. And the offices and the press were shut down. So he talks in one of his memoirs about having to take copy either up to Philadelphia to get them to print it there, or down to D.C. to use the presses at other newspapers. And they were able to continue to put out a paper during all this and cover the fire in pretty substantial ways. So that's another way in which Mencken kind of loved the mechanics of newspapers, knew the city, etc.
You wrote in your book about H.L. Mencken, Damning Words, that Mencken viewed literary criticism as a catalytic, meaning something that helps two other substances react. In this case, the author and his audience. Did Mencken think that press criticism also could serve that same positive purpose?
I would say yes, although I don't know that he wrote about that in the same way. And I would say yes in the sense that his columns, he wound up initially having a what we would almost call today a blog post. I forget the name of it, freelance maybe, I think was what it was called. And he would have a running digest of things that struck him in the news or different. So there was modest amount of editorializing, some just kind of reflecting out loud, some noting different events going on in the city, or some figure who's visiting town. And eventually, though, he does have a syndicated column where he becomes more outspoken, and that's another part of his growing fame, where people want to read Mencken, even if they don't like it. It's one of those, push and pull things. And in that sense, I think he saw that op-eds, at least, could be that kind of catalytic in sparring between an audience and the sorts of things that newspapers were covering.
D.G. Hart is Associate Professor of History at Hillsdale College. His book on H.L. Mencken is Damning Words, The Life and Religious Times of H.L. Mencken. Dr. Hart, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Good to be with you.
That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Matthew Spalding, Tim Carney, and D.G. Hart. The Radio Free Hillsdale Hour is recorded at the studios of WRFH, the student-run radio station at Hillsdale College. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. The assistant producer of the program is Sam Lair. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.